Now, you work with a lot of business leaders. You are one yourself. And if somebody walked into a room and said, you always have to say yes, you can't say no, you're going to get shown to the door pretty quickly. What the actual philosophy is, it's not that you can't say no, and it's not that you always have to say yes. But what we do is basically suspend judgment. And we start with that yes. And we can say no 15 minutes later. But especially nowadays, information is so accessible. Literally in the last 20 years, information went from, for thousands of years, the issue was scarcity. When we were growing up, we had to go to a library to find something, and then often that library had to order it from somewhere. Right. Nowadays, with all this information available, it's very easy for everyone to consider themselves an expert. And so we snap to judgment. We automatically see the reasons why this can't be done, as opposed to if we just start with yes and open ourselves up, slow down a little bit before we make those judgments.
This is the Future Ready Advisor, a show about transforming your financial advisory practice. I'm your host, Sam Sivarajan, a wealth management consultant, behavioral scientist, and keynote speaker. In this podcast, I dive deep into the real challenges advisors face and bring you insightful conversations with top industry experts. Together, we'll explore practical strategies grounded in behavioral science to help you better serve your clients, optimize your time, and build a future-ready practice. Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Sam Sivarajan. Welcome to today's episode of the Future Ready Advisor. Today, I'm here with Ian Keeling, actor, author, improv artist, and corporate coach. Ian, welcome to the show.
Hi, Sam. I'm glad to be here.
Pleasure to have you. Let me quickly introduce you to our audience. Ian is an actor and author. He is a member of the Improv theater community in Toronto and teaches at Second City. He also leads corporate workshops and uses the improv technique to create agile mindsets aimed to improve leadership, build teams, strengthen presentations, increase problem-solving skills, and reduce stress. Exactly the approach to adapt and excel in this increasingly uncertain world. Ian, just diving in, can you introduce yourself to the audience and share a bit about your journey as an actor and what led you to improv? Were there any pivotal moments that significantly shaped your career?
Yeah, oddly enough, my career as an artist began wanting to be a novelist. I wanted to be a writer since I was like 12 years old. But along the way, I ended up stumbling into improv in high school. A buddy of mine said there was this group called Theater Sports, and he suggested, hey, let's go down and do this workshop. So we went down. Back then, it was basically pay what you can. And I went. I loved it. The guy I went with never came back. I've been doing it now for over 30 years. And the interesting thing is that's eventually what led me to professional development. Is after I finished university, I came back, I rejoined Theater Sports. I very rapidly began teaching and facilitating workshops on sort of the artist side. Along the way, I figured if I was going to starve as a writer, I may as well starve as an actor too. So I started doing more traditional acting, theater. Didn't get very far in film, and we might talk about that a little later when we talk about how to handle stress and some of the sort of ups and downs you go through, which I think improv helps you navigate. But rapidly, we started doing corporate workshops, facilitating simply things like communication or presentation skills. And then I've been doing that now for over 20 years. I do it freelance. It eventually led me down a path where I also now do a lot of public speaking coaching, because so many of the things associated with public speaking are actually tied to like mindsets and the way we approach things. And so, and oddly enough, one of the companies that I ended up working with on the public speaking front, I got involved with because somebody in one of my professional science fiction writing groups had moved up the corporate world, started doing keynotes, and they had gotten in coaching themselves because they were terrified of it. And that was the connection that I ended up making. And that's the thing I love about improv is I think the number one thing it teaches you to do is just to be open to any change that comes your way. And that's sort of the way I've always approached it.
And that's a great point to perhaps expand on for our audience. Can you talk a little bit about that improv mindset and what it is? Define it a bit, but Then maybe expand that a little bit to explain why you believe that improv mindset is particularly applicable to today's world and all of the uncertainty and complexity that we face in the professional or personal world.
Yeah. One of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to separate the term improv and the ability to improvise, even though they are directly tied together. One of the things that has happened over the years is improv has automatically been associated with its artistic side, the performance element of it. Literally, if you look up improv, every single dictionary, somewhere in the very first definition, it talks about it as a performance technique. But the ability to improvise is something that we've been doing literally for thousands and thousands of years. And that to me is the interesting part of what we call improv. Is it's not necessarily about getting on stage. It's not necessarily about being performing, or certainly even about being funny, because that's often what it gets associated with, which is comedy. Improv is basically the ability to adapt to change with other people. It's collaborative, and that's the essential part of it, because let's face it, we've all had to adapt to change over the last 5 years. And I know this is so much a part of your thought leadership and the way you approach what you do. And that to me is the reason why I'm always telling people improv is the most important skill of the 21st century. It's not about getting on stage. It's about slowing down, being present, and then adapting to that change. If you want to call it the agile mindset, you can. But more importantly, doing it collaboratively. We have to be able to do it together.
I like that. And I think it's an important point that you make. And thank you for that distinction, because I do believe that most people will think improv as a performance at the local theater. And while that's important, I think the point that you're making is critical, and it's in a more professional mindset. It is the word that I would use and have used is adapt, right? This is skills that human beings have evolved with over thousands of years, and we adapt and we need to adapt. And in an increasing uncertain world, we need to be better and build that skills to adapt and adapt collaboratively. And that improv mindset and training, to your point, and we'll dive into it a little bit more, is crucial, I think, to help kind of build those skills and that resiliency to be able to adapt to things that are unexpected.
Yeah, absolutely. Because for most of human history, change happened at a relatively slower pace, but it's been accelerated and accelerating over the last 100 years, and it's accelerated even more in the last 10, 15, 20. And literally some of the paradigm shifts that are happening in the ways that something as simple as the way we process information, it's constantly evolving. And there is one thing that human beings, oddly enough, we are extremely good at adapting to change, because it is literally one of the reasons why we have evolved the way we have. But oddly enough, it's also one of the things that there's a part of our brain that is resistant to, that fears it, especially because for most of our thousands of years of history, those changes at least happened at a more leisurely pace, as opposed to something nowadays where you blink and there's something new coming up, whether it's, Chat GPT, or whether it's just every social media. I'm terrible on social media because I'm 50 years old, and every single time I start using a platform, within 2 years, I'm like, oh, nobody over 30 uses that anymore. Okay. There's a quote I have on my website, professionalimproviser.com. In the long history of humankind, those who have learned to collaborate and improvise most effectively have prevailed. That's not from an artist, that's from Charles Darwin. And that's the huge thing about improv, is I think it's always been important. We've always, oddly enough, been pretty good at it, but more and more reminding ourselves of some of those things that let us just slow down a little bit in this fast changing world and then be present. That's, I think, what is going to be extremely important in this century and probably for some time to come.
You're absolutely right. I think these are skills that we've always had, and change has always been a feature of humanity. And your point is valid that perhaps 500 years ago, the rate of change wasn't as fast as it is now. The skills have always been there. There are times where I feel that those skills atrophied to some extent because we don't use it as much. And maybe the best example I would use is that before GPS, the skills about orienting yourself and navigating with a map or getting a general sense of direction, at least perhaps that's just my, my perspective, but I would have thought it's deteriorated in the world of GPS. That most people don't know where north, south, east, west is without having a GPS to tell them.
Yeah, or something as simple as, and I mean, we've all probably experienced that thing where Google Maps or like one of the apps tells us, all right, this is the way to go. And you're looking at the traffic in front of you going, I'm pretty sure it's not. And the funny thing is, GPS is probably accurate most of the time, but there's still times where we can get locked in and not necessarily like trust our instincts. And there's been multiple studies about creativity and the fact that like before we're 5 years old, we're amazing at it. And I've been saying for years, because I've also worked with kids for like over 3 decades, and it's amazing. You get kids under 10 years old and they're like automatically brilliant improvisers, you know. But as we get older, we get more locked in, and this is a discovery that I've made, and I've especially been working on more over the last decade as I've realized how often we get locked into like, oh, we're going to watch this specific thing on Netflix and we're not going to experiment as much as we did when we were younger. And I think one of the things that improvising lets us do is we have these skills, but it taps us back into that exploratory mindset that we had when we were younger that sometimes can atrophy a bit as we move on through life.
So let's talk about that a bit. The practice of improv has obviously evolved, and certainly believe that you're seeing it more and more outside of traditional, call it theater settings, and more in real life, because as you say, the skills are about adapting. Can you talk a little bit about that, how you've seen that evolution play out, and how it resonates with the non-theater crowd, the professional crowd? How is that resonating?
Yeah. Well, one of my favorite things, and this has been true since I started teaching in the 90s, is when you have an improv class, and even if it's in a theatrical setting, like say someone takes a class at Second City, you're not just getting people who want to be actors. You're not just getting people who are artists. You get people from all walks of life. You get a lawyer, you get a math professor, you get somebody who's like works in healthcare. And so you're getting all these different perspectives, which automatically makes it a better learning venue. But the other thing that you get out of it is within about 2 or 3 months, I almost inevitably have students coming up to me and just saying something like, I'm using this a lot. And the two most common things I hear are people saying they're using this outside of class. And then the other one is, this is the most fun night of my week because it's interactive, it's collaborative, it is fun. I tend to approach this in a setting like this a little bit more seriously, especially because I'm sort of fighting against that. It's not all, yuck, yuck, yuck. But they're also the most fun things that you can do. When I do a workshop, especially if we have like a few hours to do it, it's not just somebody sitting listening to me. It's getting up, putting these things into practice. And the other funny thing is people tend to associate humor with jokes. The humor that's accessible to most people is those moments that we have where we're just sort of riffing off each other. And so automatically also people end up laughing.
It's a great point. And I want to dive a little bit deeper into this idea that you said the first point that people make months after the class is that they're actually applying it in daily life. So can you talk a little bit about how they're applying it? And for business leaders and financial advisors, what might be some of the techniques, improv techniques that they can adopt to help better navigate in day-to-day life, whether at work or at home?
Yeah. Well, there's the big famous one, which is start with yes. At Second City, yes and has literally become a brand. And the interesting thing about that is there's sometimes a misconception that means you always have to say yes in an improv scene. I taught in a lot of high schools where we do outreaches, and I'd go in and I'd say to the class, can you say no in an improv scene? And they'd all like look at their teacher and go, no, of course you can't say no. Now, you work with a lot of business leaders. You are one yourself. And if somebody walked into a room and said, you always have to say yes, you can't say no, you're going to get shown to the door pretty quickly. What the actual philosophy is, it's not that you can't say no, and it's not that you always have to say yes. But what we do is basically suspend judgment. And we start with that yes. And we can say no 15 minutes later. But especially nowadays where information is so accessible, literally in the last 20 years, information went from, for thousands of years, the issue was scarcity. When we were growing up, we had to go to a library to find something, and then often that library had to order it from somewhere. Right. Nowadays, with all this information available, it's very easy for everyone to consider themselves an expert. And so we snap to judgment. We automatically see the reasons why this can't be done. As opposed to if we just start with yes and open ourselves up, slow down a little bit before we make those judgments. Not only does that lend itself to creativity, in my experience, it's actually a lot more efficient, because so often we'll end up cutting things off, and it turns out that we have to go back and fix it later, because a lot of times the things that our brain is certain of may not have always been the right answer depending on the circumstance, and especially when you're dealing with any kind of industry where you are interacting with human beings and you're interacting with a constantly changing environment.
I like that a lot, Ian. I think your point about it fostering creativity is bang on. I presume it also fosters engagement, right? If you're not immediately cutting off somebody that is coming up with an idea or a thought and you're hearing them out, I think it's got to be good for engagement and camaraderie, if you will, between whether it's with a client, an advisor, or colleagues, etc. And there was something very important that you said. You're just suspending judgment. That doesn't mean that you don't say no. It's that your immediate response when somebody comes up with something isn't no. You might be thinking it, but you're suspending judgment or saying anything to hear it out, to hear the idea being fleshed out and give it proper consideration. And 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes later, you might still say no.
Yeah, absolutely. I have ADHD, and to a certain extent, one of the greatest days of my life was when I was officially diagnosed, because that explained why I've spent my entire life cutting people off halfway through a sentence. And so often we do it. And one of the things I've actually been teaching for years in my improv classes is the fact that because we're so good at adapting and we're so good at thinking forward as a species, even in the moment. So when somebody starts speaking, often halfway through the sentence, we're like, oh, I know where they're going. I can jump in. Let's be efficient. And the strange thing is, 9 times out of 10, we're probably right, or at least in the right ballpark. Now, the problem is that 1 time out of 10, we're not right. We're usually, when we're wrong, we're not like a little bit wrong. We're like, oh, we're going off the rails kind of wrong. But the other thing is, when we talk about listening, and more we've discovered this. Yes, it is important for us to actually hear the content of what somebody is saying. But sometimes the thing that gets lost is, for a person speaking, it's not just enough that they've been heard. They have to feel like they've been heard. And that's where letting someone finish. There's literally a game that we play called first line, first word, last word, where someone speaks a sentence, and then the response, you have to begin with the last word in the previous speaker's sentence. So if somebody said something like, I'm going to go on a podcast today, the first word of my response has to be today. And it can lead to some very grammatically incorrect conversations. But what it forces you to do is stay there for the whole sentence.
That's a great point. It's a skill that we all need to develop. I'm the first person I can tell you, my family can tell you that there's a certain passion that is involved, and that can translate into interrupting, right? And somebody told me, so I'm a work in progress, trust me, but somebody told me, and I love the way that they put it, most of us listen to respond. Some listen to listen, and the very, very few, and this is the pinnacle of what you should strive for, is that we listen to understand. And I think that makes a real big difference in, as you say, the other person feeling understood. And there, and I had a boss that told me this as well. If the person has been understood and they feel understood, you can say no, and it's still okay at that point. They feel that they've said their piece, that you've understood it, and that you have other reasons for saying no, and they give you the benefit of the doubt. If you are listening to respond, you don't get that benefit of the doubt from the other person.
Yeah, because immediately you've removed all of those frustration emotions, all of those things that often get in the way of us just approaching a conversation from what's actually being said. Also, sometimes it's what's the inferred thing that people are saying, and sometimes we can jump to that. But I find with that kind of information, I once worked with an artificial intelligence expert, and they talked about the difference, and I hope I get this right because it's been a while, but the difference between data, information, and inference. And when he started explaining what it was in terms of data is like the raw piece of information, information is it in more depth, inference is what that information might infer. I suddenly realized that there was a exercise called information booth that I'd been doing for years. And it's very simple. Somebody acts like they're working at an information booth. One at a time, people come up and ask questions. I usually give people the setting of the mall. And I'll demonstrate it for the group, but then I'll have them do it. And the first thing I always encourage people, because it is a comedy class and people often want to be clever or funny, and I say, you're not going to be funny. You're not even going to be interesting. Just give the person what they want. And immediately, now we're not cutting people off. But the thing that starts happening is, and the example I give with an information booth is, often somebody in a shopping mall, let's say, might walk up to an information booth and go, excuse me, is there a pet store in this mall? Now, there's different ways you can answer that question. One is you can just provide the data, which is literally there are only 3 words that you can use to answer that question if you're just looking at the answer to the specific thing they asked. Is there a pet store in this mall? Yes, no, maybe. But the minute I ask the class, well, what does the person actually want? What's the information that they're looking for? The information they're looking for is, where is it? But then in even deeper, and I think this is where that active listening and actually paying attention to all that is being said by the person, and especially if we're in person, that also includes nonverbal communication, is what's the want that's also under that? So with the pet store example, right? Is there a pet store in this mall? Yes. It's up the stairs to the left. That's great. But there's also an inference. That person is probably interested in pets. That person is probably, maybe they even want something by the end of the day. And now, I mean, if you're talking about sales, now you can get into things like upselling, where maybe the person doesn't want the next thing that you offer. They can say no. But what it does do is it now leads to deeper conversations and much deeper connections, because so many industries, no matter where you work, it's about networking and making connections in some way, shape, or form. And when you suddenly realize those simple ways we're connected, all of a sudden, now we can have simple conversations, even if it's something as simple as like, oh, you've got a pet. Hey, what's your dog's name? And that's where now we can connect on a human level.
That's a great example, Ian. I love it. I love that differentiation. And you're right, that going to that inference involves deeper listening, processing, but creating that sense of engagement that you're building a deeper connection. And you're right. In our working world, that deeper connection, whether you're an advisor with a client or whether the person that you meet in line at the store, I think that's kind of important, right? So you've done this, so like these examples, like the information booth, you've done this in workshops. How have people, like the professionals, the business people, the people call it cut and dried, how have they reacted when you've introduced these types of improv techniques in getting them to think about it? And what have the results been?
There are 2 reactions, especially, let's say this isn't something where someone's come to take an improv class. Which, by the way, I'll say this at the end, and I am probably undercutting my own professional career, but the most efficient, cost-efficient thing that every business can do is just pay for everybody to go take improv classes. But let's say they hire a professional like me, and the company finds out they're going to do an improv class. Often they may not even tell the group that's going to be involved. And I mean, we could be talking about 15 to 20 people. We could be talking about 300. But if they have been told ahead of time, first we get that misconception getting in the way. And I often hear things like, okay, so just so you know, a lot of people are really excited about this, but there's probably going to be like 3 or 4 people that you might not, they might not participate. And I'll say, okay, because my philosophy has always been, if you want to sit out, that's fine. When I used to teach in certain schools that were, say, in tougher areas of Toronto, a lot of times if you come in with some kind of arts thing, there's going to be a few kids that are like, yeah, this isn't my thing. And I'd always tell the kids, it's like, look, give me the first exercise, and after that, if you want to sit out and just observe, you can. And it's funny, the minute you give people that opportunity of choice, it's amazing how quickly they'll come on board. And what I find is, I'll hear that, oh, there's going to be some people who aren't going to participate at all. We'll begin the workshop, and we begin it with something as simple as just a quick little, like, let's get to know each other a little bit exercise. And I would say by halfway through, let's say we're an hour in, I can't tell who the people are who are going to actively resist. There might be a few people that I can tell, all right, you needed a little bit to come on board. But once people do, they start to realize, well, one, we're not doing anything that you're pretty good at this already. You know how to do this. And once they realize, I'm not necessarily going to put them up on stage and make them do a song and dance. Instead, we're just working on like, oh, how do we connect? How do we tell each other's stories? How do we actively listen to each other? All of those things become skills that very quickly become something that people go, oh, okay, I see how they can use this. A really common one I find is people who are, say, running meetings or something as simple as that. Again, improv often teaches you to suspend judgment. It also helps you to slow down just a little bit, which, again, we're facing a crisis of speed worldwide. Everything is changing so rapidly that by just slowing that down that little bit, all of a sudden they're running meetings, or they're being in meetings where now they're coming out of the meeting and not having that thing that I'm certain everyone has experienced, which is you sit in an hour-long meeting and you walk out and go, so what was that about again? And all of a sudden our communication just becomes clear. It becomes more efficient. And more importantly, people feel like they've been part of that process.
Makes sense. So, Ian, what is one memorable experience from your improv career that stands out to you? And what lesson did you learn from it that you think applies and can be valuable for business professionals?
This is one of those, this is almost like the tell me about yourself question you get in job interviews, where it's like you kind of dread it. For me, so the interesting thing for me is maybe the most memorable experience that I could sort of directly that ties to a lesson that affected my entire life, oddly enough, is more about a failure. It starts with a great success. The first really good improv scene you do. And in terms of, let's say we're talking about performing, that means all the scaffolding disappears, those kind of whose line is it anyway type of games, which are very structured. You get to a place where eventually all you do is get one suggestion from an audience, and then you perform like a 5 to 7 minute long sketch. And often it doesn't turn out great. You can get to a point in your career where you can make sure that it's always like pretty solid. That's what we need to do in corporate. It's like I always tell people, if you see a corporate improv show, you're probably not going to see a lot of 10 out of 10 scenes. You're probably going to see a lot of 7s or 8s, because that way I don't end up doing a 3. But there are those magic moments where all of a sudden you do a scene and it's like, oh, that's amazing. Like people are talking about it at the bar afterwards. People are talking about it like 4 or 5 weeks later, 7 or 8 shows later. They're like, oh, you remember that scene you did? The first time you do that, great. Not average, not okay, not even pretty good, but great scene. Well, what's the instinct in that situation? What do we
Trying to
want
bottle it,
with our
right?
next scene? We want to bottle it, and it's got to happen again, and it's got to happen again, and it's got to happen again. But like so many things in life, you're not doing a 10 out of 10. You're not hitting a home run 500 times in a row. The first time that happened to me, what happened to me happened to a lot of people, which is you can kind of get inside your head, and now you're overanalyzing it, and you got to make everything perfect. There's this 0 to 10 mindset that's started to be talked about a lot in a lot of different ways. I find with the public speaking clients that I have, imposter syndrome is a concept that comes up a lot, and it's so much of it is tied to that perfectionism. And I got into that headspace for about 5 years. I mentioned I didn't have much of a film career, literally because right around the time that this started happening, I started overanalyzing everything I was doing, comparing myself to everyone else. And I got into this headspace for like 4 or 5 years. And I managed to sort of keep going professionally, but it did affect a lot of my growth opportunities. And in this mindset, one of the things that happened was I got to the point where I couldn't audition for film because I was just so inside my head. I couldn't even do that thing where film auditions, you often show up and the first thing you do is look into the camera and you tell them, "Hi, I'm Ian from Talent, Talent, Talent." And then you turn to the left because they want a profile shot. And I struggled with even that. And it wasn't until about 5 or 6 years later, I'm out at a bar. I run into an old friend. I hadn't seen him in a long while, and he was, somebody I performed with for years. And he says to me, "Hey, I haven't seen you around. What's going on?" And out it all came, and far more extensively than I'm going to do on a podcast where we have a limited time. But for me, it felt like for about 5, maybe even 10 minutes, all of that sort of self-recrimination, beating myself up came out. And at the end of it, he looked at me and said, "Yeah, no, I get it. It's easy to get inside your head. Be average." And that thought hit me really hard. And it took me a few years to sort of process it. One of the things I realized very early on, and this sort of relates back to that, you always have to say yes thing, was he wasn't saying you should be average all the time. He wasn't saying you can't strive for excellence, which is something we should all strive for. We should train so that we try to hit the home run. We win, as it were. But if you just accept the fact that sometimes it's okay to be okay, it's okay to be average, all of a sudden you've removed that 0 or 10 mindset. I'm often telling my speaking clients, because everyone wants to memorize exactly their speech, and I'm always telling my speaking clients, you don't have to ever memorize a speech again. Know your information. If you have some statistics, maybe have those in some notes. But that pressure of getting everything perfect, it's not sustainable. It's also not efficient, because then we waste all this time trying to reach this unattainable goal, as opposed to let's strive for excellence. Let's put in the work. But then when we need to say, I don't know, do a podcast, now let's just be in the moment and trust that we've put in the work. And hey, if we hit a home run, great.
That's
Sometimes it
such
might
great
just be
advice.
pretty good.
That's such great advice. It's hard to follow. It's especially for type A type personalities, but it is
It's
great
so
advice.
hard to follow.
And but the reality is, and you used the home run analogy. The reality is that a top baseball player who hits lots of home runs hits next and gets a hit. If they're batting 300, meaning 3 times out of 10 they get a hit, they're considered top of their sport. Right? I mean, yes, baseball is slightly different than professional day-to-day work, but to your point, I think the improv mindset allows people to kind of be fluid. So maybe the beginning of your conversation or your meeting isn't a 10 out of 10, but if you give it time and if you are more forgiving with yourself, perhaps the opening that the client or that the colleague provides you, you can find a way to get to 8, 9, or 10 out of 10 type of meeting. But it's a fluid situation that evolves. But you have to stay at the game. You got to be at the plate. Continue to get that opportunity to bring it to a 8, 9, or 10 out of 10. If you sit there and think right at the beginning, "Oh my God, this is a 3 out of 10. It's going horribly," and pull yourself out of the game, there is no opportunity to get a better outcome.
Yeah. And it's funny. One of the first things that I've heard so many other improv teachers say is, go fail. I'm always telling my classes, it's like, you should feel uncomfortable at times and it's okay to fail. And that's something where, let's say we apply it to, I don't know, investing. And all of a sudden that seems like, oh, well, all right, that's certainly not what we want when people are investing their money. And yet, and I could be speaking out of school here, but as an investor, not every investment will always pan out. And I would imagine in order to be able to make the strongest investments, at times you have to take risks, at times you have to play it safe. But also, if you need success in every single investment you make, I'll turn this around and ask you the question: how long are you going to be able to mentally survive in that environment?
You can't. I think you hit the nail on the head. The reality is, this is what we talk about portfolio diversification. I don't care who you
Right.
are. Not even Warren Buffett makes every investment is a winner. What makes Warren Buffett successful is that most of his investments are winners, and so that they win by more than his bad investments lose. And I know that is what good advisors do, is that they recommend diversified portfolios for their clients with the idea that on average, or better than average, most of those stocks in that portfolio or the investments in that portfolio will do well. Some won't. And that's the mindset that you're talking about, that you should have this. The idea of failing is a good mindset to have, and you forgive yourself and you're prepared for that, so that you're not trying too hard. The idea is not to get 10 out of 10 in your investment portfolio. If you get 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 consistently, that's a great track record.
Yeah, because when it's so easy to get trapped, where if you're trying to, if perfection's the only goal, what ends up happening is you just end up wasting time, because okay, well, I'm going to do it in the writing world. Let's do one more edit, right? Let's say I was doing a play. Oh, I got to rehearse it one more time. But especially, I would imagine, if you're dealing with something as time sensitive as investing, whether or not you get it perfect, the opportunity is only going to be there for so long. And that's one of the biggest things is if we let go a little bit of that perfect mindset, we're more likely to actually take the opportunities when they're available, and they won't always pan out, but we'll also have more opportunities.
Look, one of my favorite sayings is the perfect is the enemy of good. And the idea is that you can always wait for something that is perfect. And in reality, that means that you should always be waiting, because there's always the potential that there's something better around the corner. But the problem with that mindset is that you're always waiting.
When I got stuck in that mindset, it literally prevented me from writing some books. There was the third book of a trilogy that I wrote. I put off writing the third book for 2 years because I kept telling myself I wasn't smart enough to write my own book. So there's a mindset there, but also that it's got to be right. I've got to get like everything prepared, as opposed to just write the first draft. It's probably not going to be that great. I'm always telling people, like, the first draft of anything, and this could be like research and development, it's meant to be bad. Create that pile and then start working through it and finding the success. And it's such a more efficient way of working.
That's a great approach, having written a couple of books. The challenge with word processors, and I'm a word processor user, is that you believe that the words that you put on the page, they're set in stone, right? The old-fashioned way of writing it out and scratching it out, it's more time-consuming. Nobody does it. But there was something to that made you feel that this was a draft. That was one of my big inhibiting factors. What's on the page has to be earth-shattering. I can't tell you how many drafts I went through. It took me so long to put the first draft together. But once that first draft was on paper, I think I went through 20 drafts in a matter of weeks, just because that first draft was the big hurdle to get through. And then once you see it on paper, as long as good authors say, kill your darlings, right? And that's a hard mindset to get into, that you can always do better. But I think, to your point, it comes with mindset as to if you sit there and say this has got to be perfect when I put it out there, it's scary. And it can stop people from trying anything, whether it's writing a book, whether it's getting on stage on improv, or whether it's actually trying new initiatives to build out a financial advisory practice.
Yeah, because time is always going to keep moving forward. And so with improv, because sometimes we're doing this on stage in front of an audience, if halfway through the scene is struggling, we don't get to stop, analyze what's going wrong, and then fix it. You fix it on the fly and you do the best you can. And it's amazing how often you will actually end up with something that's pretty strong. And there's so many places where the world doesn't stop and let us get it exactly right. And there are places where, look, I want some perfection.
Heart surgery.
If I'm working with a surgeon, I want them to have a 10 out of 10 mindset. I want even them to have a little bit of that God complex in the operating room. On the other hand, when they're done and they're speaking to the patient and they're about to outline, so here's how the next 6 months are going to go. Well, if I'm the patient, I'm not going to be able to live up to that level of perfection. I'm probably not going to do every single thing that I'm supposed to do in the next 6 months. Hopefully, I will do most of it. And so a little human being inside that surgeon, a little imperfection is actually something I'm more likely to relate to. It also means I'm probably more likely to listen and not just give up halfway through the instructions and going, well, I'm not going to be able to do all of this. And so I'm actually more likely to do most of what is required of me. And there's so many places where, yes, there are times where it better be excellent. But one of my favorite misconceptions that I like to address is the whole failure is not an option. That's a quote that gets thrown around a lot, and I've certainly seen it thrown around a lot in corporate circles. I love space. I'm a big space. I'll watch every little YouTube video about like how there's a hexagon on the top of Saturn, and like all those interesting facts. So one of the things you learn is, failure is not an option comes from the Apollo 13 mission. And it's a line that's literally said in the movie that was done 20, 30 years ago. And I've heard people say things like, well, we didn't get to the moon. Failure is not an option. Like, that's a NASA proverb. And I'm like, let's settle down. Because aside from the fact that we know that it took, it wasn't Apollo 1 or Gemini 1 that landed on the moon. There had to be a lot of them, even in that specific circumstance. The person who said it was a guy named Gene Kranz. He was the flight director for that specific mission. When he said failure is not an option, he was talking about a specific circumstance of these 3 people. This was the mission where basically there was a problem with the spaceship on the way to the moon. The module got damaged. And so it looked like those 3 astronauts might not make it back. And so the flight director said failure is not an option, with the specific aspect of those 3 people are coming back alive. In order to make that happen, they put somebody in a flight simulator where they literally ran the potential mission thousands of times and failed. If they ran it 1,000 times, they failed 999 times before they found the one way to make it work. And so the funny thing is, not only was failure an option, failure with that mission in order to get that one specific outcome actually required an excess of failure in order to finally lead to that success. And I mean, that's the other thing that improv teaches you is it's not possible to be perfect. It's not possible to be perfect with other people because you have your ideas, they have theirs, but we figure out a way to make it work.
That's a great segue to the last question before we dive into the rapid fire sequence. So failure is a reality, and you have to work with other people that you don't know how they're going to react. And this is the reality that advisors face on a daily basis. So in terms of client engagement and building that trusted client relationship, not knowing what they're going to say, what would you say that advisors should take away from this conversation about improv principles and using that to build more productive, positive conversations, more trusted relationships, and better outcomes with their clients?
Yeah. I think it starts with suspending judgment and being open. You're going to have some clients where they are a little bit more risk averse. You have some clients who want to take more risks. And the flip side of this is you want to be open-minded, but you're still going to come with your expertise. There's a myth in improv that there's no structure, there's no plans at all. That is not true. For me, if I expanded the definition of the ability to improvise beyond just it's the ability to adapt to change with other people, if I were to define adapt to change, what that means is it means the ability to adapt whenever the plan alters or shifts, or perhaps the plan wasn't present at the beginning of whatever endeavor you're beginning. But there's still some structure. It's like jazz. And so as a financial advisor, you're going to come in with your knowledge, and we don't want to get rid of that. We don't want to surrender that. But the ability to come in and then listen to whatever your client needs, to slow down enough to just be present. And oddly enough, in doing that, you'll also probably be able to get your client to slow down a little bit and not make those rash snap judgments. I'm a huge sports fan, and every single time an owner buys an NBA team, they immediately trade for the best player in the league. And, don't worry about it. We'll just give up the other 9 players and our future draft picks. And it's like, great. Now you have, Kevin Durant, but you need 5 people and maybe even a few bench people as well. And this situation can be pretty common. And by the way, it wasn't that the instinct was wrong, but sometimes it might just be, let's just slow down, suspend judgment. And you know what? Maybe we'll make that choice tomorrow or the day after, or even an hour from now.
That's great. And I love the analogy around jazz, because that really brings and paints that picture. So, Ian, we're coming to the end of our podcast. So I have a few final rapid fire questions for you that I ask all of my guests. So, number 1, professionally, what is the most important lesson you've learned over the years?
So the most important lesson I've learned, but I'm still working on applying as much as I can, is letting things go. And the one you most common here is you've got to let, the failures go and not, carry those with you. But relating back to some of our conversation, I think you also have to be able to let go your successes and learn from them and strive for them, but also don't make them, again, that 0 or 10 mindset where it always has to end up this way. And then the other one that comes to mind is, and this is the thing that improv gets you to embrace, sort of some of your more subconscious thinking and your gut instincts, because sometimes, again, you're going to have to think on your feet. And the one I have found that I think is important for an artist, but I imagine it's also important for any kind of opportunity, is if your gut says there's an opportunity here, you should pursue it as much as possible without any excuses. It's like, follow that instinct. And it might not always pan out, but there's a lot of things that sometimes get in the way of us following that. So those would be my 2 things. Let things go. And if there's an opportunity, go for it.
I love that. The point about successes, letting go of the successes, I think that is so powerful. Number 2, what is one practical tip you would offer listeners keen on applying the insights that you've discussed?
So the thing about the practical tip is, so much of improv is collaborative. So many of the exercises we do, you're going to want to do with people. I do sometimes get people asking, well, what can I do at home? But the one that comes to mind that relates to, let's just say, the concept of slowing down. And I find often we have to actually start with just giving ourselves permission to do it. If I'm doing a public speaking workshop, just giving yourself permission to pause, but even sometimes just permission to just take a second and process. And so one of the things I find people can do is, if you find a low stakes environment, right, there should be some stakes. So let's say a meeting. And let's say you wanted to just work on the concept of being present and slowing down. So we just start with the idea of just actually make yourself do that. So at the next meeting you have, in the first 2 or 3 minutes that you're going to be speaking, deliberately pause 4 times. It only has to be even for a second, because oddly enough, yes, sometimes it'll be more effective if you pause longer. But all we're doing is actually just making us present with what we're saying in the moment, and then practicing the actual giving ourselves permission, where if we need to pause, then we have that tool available to us. And that's sort of one very simple thing you can work on if you're working on trying to be more present and just slowing down a little bit.
That's great. Ian, fantastic discussion. If listeners want to learn more about you or find out about your work, where should they go?
You can find my website at professionalimproviser.com, VISOR, it's like doctor. You can find me on LinkedIn, but a lot of my social media, I'm in the process of rebranding, and I am terrible at it. So I would say go to the website first. I have a book coming out at the end of the year. It's actually a simple public speaking tip book. I'm halfway through the first draft of an actual improv book about its importance. That will hopefully come out sometime next year. And then beyond that, the one thing I would just like to encourage everybody is go take an improv class. It will, you'll be using it a lot.
Awesome. Ian, thank you for joining us today on the Future Ready Advisor.
Thank you so much for having me.
In this episode, I spoke with Ian Keeling, actor, improv artist, and corporate coach. Here are my 3 key takeaways from this discussion. Number 1, improv as a mindset for adaptability. Ian explains that improv isn't just for performers, it's a way of thinking that helps you adapt to unexpected changes collaboratively. This mindset, essential in today's fast-paced world, fosters creativity and builds resilience in both personal and professional settings. Number 2, the power of yes and. While not always about agreement, this technique encourages suspending judgment and exploring ideas fully before making decisions. For advisors, this approach can enhance client engagement and open pathways to deeper connections and innovative solutions. Number 3, failure is part of the process. Ian emphasizes that striving for perfection can inhibit growth and innovation. Instead, focus on progress and learning from mistakes. Whether it's a first draft of a speech or a meeting that didn't hit all the marks, the key is staying in the game and trusting the process. These insights remind us that flexibility, listening, and letting go of perfection can transform how we connect and lead. Thank you for tuning in to the Future Ready Advisor. You've been listening to the Future Ready Advisor. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify, or share your feedback wherever you listen. Be sure to follow the podcast so you never miss an episode. For more insights on how to keep your practice future ready, visit www.samsivarajan.com. You can find the link on the show notes. There you'll find free tools and resources, along with exclusive bonus content from these podcasts. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to sharing more strategies with you in the next episode.